Hi class, it's Professor Rourke. I wanted to make a video from one of your homework problems. This particular problem is from section 2.2 and it's number 6. So chapter 2 introduces us to all these different types of graphs, right? 2.1 was all qualitative data. So talking about like eye color or your favorite social media preference, something like a quality, not anything that's measurable or countable. 2.2 then moves us into quantitative data. So it could be discrete, it could be continuous, it could be either of those things, and we are given different options to be able to create graphs for this data. So instead of a bar graph like we had in 2.1, we could maybe have a histogram where instead of it being just separate categories like brown eyes, blue eyes, green eyes, the data is quantitative. So we have to sort of organize the data a little differently into classes. So just a little reminder, the videos inside our Canvas course are very helpful. However, if you watch this particular video from 2.2, this is section 2.2, resources and assignments. It says required resources. Watch this video. It shows how to use StatCrunch to calculate relative frequencies, distributions. Great. However, the example shown there has raw data. It's just all of the numbers listed out all for us, 7, 6, 6, 6, 4, 6, 2, 6. The problem that we have are given, the data is already organized for us, which is good, but it causes some issues in StatCrunch. If you follow these steps exactly like we did in Canvas, you'll see you have an issue because what they are doing is they think you're just referring to these categories here, and then they treat them like different categories, and they think they're all weighted the same amount. So they'll say like 0.1667, 0.1667, 0.1667. So if you had this issue, you are not alone. It's one of the problems with StatCrunch that I feel like I have never really quite figured out the best solution to make it work. It works great if you have raw data and you're asked to take a frequency table, but not so much in terms of data that's already has the frequency table for us. Okay, so now back to this problem. Again, still should watch the Canvas videos. They're still essential to making sure we understand everything. But if we take a look at this problem, it says the data to the right represents the top speed in kilometers per hour of all the players except goaltenders in a certain soccer league. Construct A, a relative frequency distribution, B, a frequency histogram, and C, a relative frequency histogram. And then they just add insult to injury. They keep asking more questions. What percentage of players had a top speed between 26 and 29.9 kilometers per hour? And then what percentage of players had a top speed of less than 13.9 kilometers per hour? So quite a few questions in here. And let's just start with the first one. The first question says, construct a relative frequency distribution. And you'll see it has a column for speed, and then it has the different classes. So 10 to 13.9 is the first class. The second class is 14 to 17.9. The third class is 18 to 21.9. The fourth class is 22 to 25.9. Then the second to last class is 26 to 29.9, and the last class, the sixth class, is 30 to 33.9. So it has a space for relative frequency. Now, if we take a look at the table they give us, they already have all the data sorted for us. They're already in the classes, which is great. We didn't have raw data. It's already organized for us. So it says that there's 3 players that have a speed between 10 to 13.9, 6 have a speed of 14 to 17.9, 18 have a speed between 18 and 21.9, 60 have a speed of 22 to 25.9, 259 have a speed between 26 and 29.9, and then lastly, 196 have a speed between 30 and 33.9. Okay. So that's great and all. However, if you try to do this, like I mentioned before, using StatCrunch, you'll see it doesn't quite flow as well as it does in the example on StatCrunch and on Canvas. So you have 2 options. Option number 1 is to use our calculator and kind of this by hand, which I love StatCrunch, but this is the one type of problem that I would maybe recommend if it's just kind of is sometimes a little simpler. So you can use a graphing calculator. You can also use just like a basic calculator that either your phone has or the basic one on your computer. So what we need to do first is to add up all of the number of players to find out the total number. So if we add them all together, we get 542. Okay, so that's my total number. And now to find the relative frequency, we just divide the number of players for each of those classes by 542, right? So we can say 3 divided by 542, and we get out 0.00553. Now, this does also ask us to round at the bottom. It kind of sneaks it in here, round to 4 decimal places as needed. So we do want to make sure that we are careful with rounding. So we count 1, 2, 3, 4 numbers, and I'm going to write a little line here. Then we look at the next number, which is a 3. So I can leave this 5 as a 5. If the number after the cutoff was a 5, 6, 7, 8, or 9, we would have had to round it to 0.0056. Okay, so rounding is a whole other can of worms that I feel like causes some issues. That's why that first section there was about rounding, and it's also tricky because sometimes you won't even read it, and you have to go all the way to the bottom of the table to see that they want you to round to 4 decimal places. So it's very easy to miss if you guys have had this before. So this next number here, 0.01107, that I would round that to 0.0111. Okay, so hopefully that makes sense. And we would just continue to do that for each of those categories. There are 6, so we have to divide this like 6 times essentially. So, it's not the best, but it's also not the worst, right? I feel like I've done worse math computations on my calculator before, and it's a little time consuming, but again, I feel like could be worse. So if you continue to go through these categories, the next one's 22 to 25.9, and we divide by 542, we get again 0.1107, and then we do the same thing for the next category, which is 259 divided by 542. That's like the biggest chunk of them. A lot of these players are pretty fast, it looks like. And then last but not least, we have our last category, 196 divided by 542, which gives 0.3616. Okay, so that's option 1. Okay, it's kind of by hand. Option 2 is we can still use StatCrunch, but we have to do it a little differently, because when we were, again, given raw data, if you watched that video, it seemed pretty easy, right? They just did stats, and then they did tables, and then they went to frequency, which again is great, but that's just for raw data. And our data is already summarized. When we clicked that, it didn't ask us if it was raw data or summarized data. So we have to kind of work around that. And this is kind of getting into some of the other things that we saw in the last section. So sometimes what I like to do is, if I really do not feel like doing this by hand, I'm going to go ahead and let me clear that off, a graph to have them calculate the relative frequency. It's just a little bit of a workaround in StatCrunch, and then I can read the data off of there. So when we are in StatCrunch and we go over to graph, and I'm actually going to click bar plot, even though this isn't supposed to be a histogram, I'm just using the bar plot to get out the relative frequencies. Okay, so if I go to graph and click bar plot, you could also do this for pie chart. But let's stick with bar plot. And then with data, no, I don't have raw data. I have summarized data. This is already grouped for us. So I'm just going to click with summary. The categories essentially are just by the speed groups that we already have, and then they count in the number of players. Okay, so again, this is typically not how we would we're not asked to create a bar graph, but it's just kind of a little bit of a workaround. I also can select relative frequency, okay, for type. So I have my categories in speed, my counts and number of players. My type is relative frequency, because that's what I'm trying to get them to do. And I'm going to select value above bar. So it just tells me it right there. So for instance, if I use my mouse to scroll over, we'll see that the relative frequency of this first group is between 0.0005, and that's what we got. And then the next group is 0.0111, that's what we got. So if you can see where I scroll over, it says relative frequency. It also has like the group that it's in, 0.0332, and then on and on, 0.1107. I'm just kind of using this to kind of double check my work now, 0.4779. And then the last group is 0.03616. So some different options for you. You can either kind of calculate it by hand, or you can kind of work around using StatCrunch by making a bar plot out of it. Okay, so then the next section asks us to create the correct frequency histogram. So again, you have a few options. You can sort of just use the data to sort of match up. Like we know, for instance, that this last section, the 26 to 29.9, should be the highest, followed by the next group. Okay, so just looking through these options, like A and B both have, they're matching up the classes like 10 to 14, 14 to 18. That's what our table shows as well. And that's not where our highest bar should be. Our highest bar should be between 26 and 30, and then after that 30 to 34. So just from looking at that alone, you could pretty much pick which option is the best one. However, you could also make a histogram out of this data and on StatCrunch and actually match it up that way as well. So let me go ahead and show you how you can do that. So here we are back in StatCrunch, and you're going to notice a similar thing to the problem with our frequency table, where if before we went to tables and did frequency, there was no option to say that the frequency table was summarized. Okay, similar to that, we have those options for chart and pie chart and bar chart, but we don't have that option for histogram. Histogram is just assumed that it has to be raw data. So what we do again is kind of like what we did before, where we sort of just kind of cheat a little bit, and we can use that same bar plot option, okay, where we have it with summary, the categories are in speed, the number of players, they want this histogram to be in frequency, and value let's go ahead and put it, it would work out either way, but let's go ahead and say worksheet. That's how we typed it in the different categories. You can type the value above bar and go ahead and click compute. So once again, we can see that this is essentially a histogram, but it should be more together and technically to make it a histogram. And just by matching the different groups like we did before, we could also have figured that out. Okay, next up is the relative frequency, which should be the exact same graph, just labeled with percentages. So the only one that fits the form that we're looking for is C. You could also have used StatCrunch. Let me go ahead and get rid of that. Which window do we have? Here we go. If I click Options, Edit, and type and change it to relative frequency, then it would have had those same values that we had from that from the first table that we labeled there. Okay, so then finally, it asks us the last two questions. It says the percentage of players that had a top speed between 26 and 29.9. So I think it'd actually be easiest just to kind of look at the table to be able to answer this question. You can use the graph, but the actual data is right here. So the relative frequency was 0.4779. So this is where they want us to change that to a percent. Okay, so we can take 0.4779 and multiply it by 100. That's the trick that we need to do to get it as a decimal, and says round to 2 decimal places, which is what we have anyways. So we can say 47.79% of the players were between 26 and 29.9. And then it says the players that were less than 13.9. Well, that has to be the first group. Okay, so that was 0.055, which again, if we multiply that by 100, would still be a decimal, would be 0.55%. Okay, so I hope that helped. I definitely understand why this question is challenging, because the videos that you see are about raw data, and now this is already summarized, which is good in theory, but makes it more difficult to use StatCrunch. So what I would recommend, if it already is summarized, you have two options. You can use your calculator to add up the number of players and then divide each categories kind of by hand. using the calculator. By hand also just means like with the aid of a calculator. Or you can use StatCrunch and sort of trick it by having it create the bar plot and find the relative frequency that way. Similar to that, for the histograms, you could just match them up. If you did this by hand, you could match up, since it's a multiple choice category, you could match up which one it is. And then same thing with relative frequency, it's going to be the same shape. Lastly, these last two questions, the biggest part is to be able to go back to the table and multiply them by 100. So I hope this was helpful. It's definitely a good question because again, when it's already summarized for us, that's great. But it kind of causes a little bit more issues in StatCrunch versus if it was raw data, you could have made a histogram right off from that, or also had a relative frequency table. So thank you for the question. Please keep them coming. Just another note, just remember for Get More Help, that's how you should see on your side to ask a question. You can also click View an Example, but that sometimes has various degrees of help. It's good. It'll walk you through to do this by hand, which is good. But when we start getting to things where like, no, doing by hand would take too long. You want to make sure that you can do this in StatCrunch. Sometimes it can not be the most helpful. Okay. Thank you guys so much. Please keep me posted. And I'm here for you for whatever questions you have. Thank you.